There's one bacteria in your gut that seems to matter more than almost any other. People who had it responded to cancer treatment. People who didn't. Your immune system isn't just in your lymph nodes. 70% of it is living in your intestines right now. And there's a specific food sitting in your grocery store right now that feeds this bacteria directly. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to eat to grow it. For most of medical history, we thought the microbes in your gut were just along for the ride, passengers not passing anything back. That assumption turned out to be almost completely wrong. Let me tell you about a colleague of mine, an oncologist in Paris, who ran a study on 200 cancer patients. Every one of them had a different cancer: breast, colon, pancreas, and every one of them received the same class of immunotherapy drug. Only about 1 in 5 actually responded well. She spent months trying to figure out what separated the responders from everyone else. Age didn't explain it, and neither did cancer type or diet, broadly speaking. One single bacteria did. A second case makes the same point from a different angle. A woman in her late 60s, metastatic melanoma, had already run out of standard options when she started an immunotherapy trial. Within her care team, nobody could confidently predict who among the trial's patients would respond and who wouldn't. The drug itself was identical for everyone. She turned out to be one of the responders, and years later, when researchers went back through the data looking for a common thread, her gut carried the same signature bacteria as nearly every other long-term responder in the study. I'm Dr. William Lee, and for close to 2 decades, my clinical focus has been the intersection of aging, immune health, and prevention, the science of staying ahead of disease rather than just treating it once it arrives. Today I want to walk you through what that bacteria is, why it seems to matter for both cancer defense and the pace at which your body ages, and, critically, exactly which foods in your kitchen right now can help it thrive. If this is the kind of science-grounded, no-hype health content you've been looking for, go ahead and subscribe before we get into it. Let's start with a question most people have never stopped to ask. Here's the question worth sitting with for a second. What is health, actually? Most of us, without thinking about it, define health as the absence of disease. If I'm not sick, I'm healthy. It sounds obvious, but that definition has a problem. You can't actively strengthen an absence. You can't train for not having cancer the way you train for a marathon. So if health isn't just the lack of disease, what is it? Research over the last 2 decades has converged on an answer. Health is the output of several hardwired defense systems your body was born with, systems that are active from your very first breath to your last. And one of the most important and most recently understood is your gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living inside your intestines. Picture it like a coral reef, not a metaphor for effect. Structurally, that's what it resembles. A dense, living ecosystem, mostly beneficial, easily disrupted by the wrong input, and capable of supporting far more than digestion alone. This reef talks constantly to your immune system, your metabolism, even your mood. And one resident of that reef appears to matter more than almost any other for both cancer defense and the aging process itself. Its name is a mouthful: Akermansia muciniphila. You'll hear me call it Akermansia for short. Keep that name in your head, because everything in the rest of this video connects back to it. Worth naming too, how recently this understanding arrived. Akermansia wasn't even formally identified until the early 2000s, and for years afterward it sat as a scientific curiosity, a bacterium researchers could see under a microscope but couldn't yet connect to anything clinically meaningful. That changed only in the last decade, as cancer researchers, metabolic researchers, and aging researchers each independently started noticing the same pattern showing up in their data. 3 separate fields converging on one bacterium is rare, and it's part of why interest in Akermansia has accelerated so quickly. One clarification before we go further, because it matters. Nothing here replaces a conversation with your own physician, particularly if you're navigating an active cancer diagnosis or currently undergoing treatment. Consider this the layer of mechanism in food science that a routine appointment rarely has time to cover. To understand why Akermansia matters, you first have to understand what immunotherapy actually does, because it's fundamentally different from chemotherapy, and the difference is the whole story. Cancer cells are remarkably good at hiding. They produce a protein called PDL1 that functions almost like a flag planted on the lawn, signaling to your immune system, "Nothing to see here, we're normal cells, leave us alone." Your immune system, patrolling constantly, sees that flag and moves on, even though the cancer is sitting right there. Immunotherapy drugs don't kill the cancer directly. Instead, they rip that flag down. Once it's gone, your own immune system can finally recognize the threat and go after it, sometimes dramatically, even in advanced metastatic disease. Here's the catch, and it's the catch that sent researchers looking at the gut in the first place. Ripping the flag down only works if the immune system underneath is strong enough to respond once it can see the target. That's the part most people never hear about. The drug does half the job. Your own biology has to do the other half. Compare that to a different kind of cancer treatment you may have heard of, CAR-T therapy, where immune cells are removed from the body, engineered in a lab to become far more aggressive hunters, and then reintroduced. That approach essentially builds the other half for you, from scratch, outside the body. It works remarkably well for certain blood cancers, but it's expensive, intensive, and not available for most solid tumors. Immunotherapy that relies on your existing immune system, boosted rather than rebuilt, is the more common path, which is exactly why the strength of that existing system, shaped in large part by your gut bacteria, ends up mattering so much. This is where that Paris study becomes so important. 200 patients, several cancer types, identical treatment, and the single clearest difference between the people who got better and the people who didn't was whether Akermansia was present in their gut. Researchers went further and tested this directly in lab models. Wipe out Akermansia with an antibiotic, and tumors kept growing despite treatment. Restore Akermansia, and tumors began shrinking again. Why would one bacteria have that kind of leverage? Because of where your immune system actually lives. Most people were taught that immune function is centered in the lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, the places that swell up when you're fighting an infection. That's incomplete. Roughly 70% of your immune system is housed inside your gut lining, layered like the filling of a jelly roll around your intestinal wall. Your bacteria sit right on the other side of that layer, close enough to talk to your immune cells constantly, the way college roommates separated by a thin dorm wall end up coordinating everything from what to eat to what time to turn the lights off. Akermansia, it turns out, is one of the loudest, most influential voices in that conversation, training and priming immune cells to actually respond when a threat like cancer needs to be recognized. Cancer defense is only half of why this bacteria matters. The other half connects directly to how your body ages. Aging isn't a single switch flipping. It's a slow accumulation of low-grade inflammation throughout the body, a process researchers increasingly refer to as inflammaging. Chronic, low-level inflammation quietly accelerates nearly everything associated with getting older. Slower tissue repair, weakened immune response, increased cardiovascular strain, and yes, higher cancer risk. Akermansia's specialty is the gut lining itself, specifically keeping the mucus layer that coats your intestines thick and intact. Think of that mucus layer as a levee. When it's strong, it keeps gut bacteria and their byproducts safely contained where they belong. When it thins out, which tends to happen naturally with age, the barrier becomes leakier, allowing low-grade inflammatory triggers to seep into the bloodstream more easily. That seepage is a meaningful contributor to inflammaging. There's a term researchers sometimes use for this specific process, leaky gut, though the clinical version of that idea is more precisely called increased intestinal permeability. It's a real, measurable finding, not a fringe concept, and it tends to worsen gradually across the decades unless something actively supports the barrier holding it in check. Akermansia appears to be one of the more powerful natural supports for that barrier, which is part of why its decline with age isn't just a curiosity, but a plausible piece of the aging puzzle itself. Multiple research groups studying aging populations have found something striking. Centenarians and unusually healthy older adults tend to carry higher levels of Akermansia than the general population. That doesn't prove one causes the other on its own, but paired with the mechanism, an intact gut barrier, lower systemic inflammation, a better trained immune system, it paints a consistent picture. A thriving population of this one bacteria appears to be a marker, and quite possibly a driver, of healthier aging. Populations often studied for unusual longevity. Parts of Okinawa, Sardinia, and a handful of other regions, sometimes grouped together as blue zones, share several dietary habits researchers have long pointed to: heavy reliance on plants, minimal processed food, and fiber intake well above what's typical elsewhere. Those same habits happen to be exactly what supports a thriving Akermansia population. It's not proof that one explains the other, but it's a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and it lines up with everything the mechanism itself would predict. Here's where most videos on this topic stop short. They'll tell you Akermansia matters and leave you with nothing to do about it. So let's fix that. You cannot currently buy Akermansia as a supplement or probiotic, despite plenty of marketing that implies otherwise. A reliable commercial form doesn't yet exist for general consumer use. What you can do is feed the Akermansia already living in your gut, encouraging it to grow. Think of yourself less as someone taking a pill and more as a gardener tending a very specific patch of soil. Pomegranate. This is the single food most consistently linked to Akermansia growth. Pomegranates are rich in compounds called elagitannins, which your gut bacteria convert into a metabolite that appears to directly stimulate the mucus layer Akermansia depends on. Practically, that means fresh pomegranate arils, or unsweetened pomegranate juice in moderation, function almost like fertilizer for this specific bacteria. The mistake most people make is reaching for pomegranate-flavored products loaded with added sugar, which undercuts the benefit almost entirely. The whole fruit, or a genuinely unsweetened juice, is what the science supports. A small handful of arils sprinkled over yogurt a few times a week is a low-effort way to build this in without turning it into a chore. Fiber-rich plant foods. Broadly, Akermansia and its neighboring bacteria feed on fiber your own digestive system can't break down. Foods like oats, leeks, asparagus, and Jerusalem artichokes are particularly well studied for this. The mistake here is assuming any fiber will do the job equally. Highly processed, high-fiber packaged foods rarely deliver the same benefit as fiber still attached to its original whole food. Rotating 2 or 3 of these into meals across the week, rather than eating the same single fiber source daily, also tends to support a wider range of beneficial bacteria beyond Akermansia alone. Fermented foods. A well-known Stanford study found that a diet rich in fermented foods, yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, measurably increased overall microbial diversity and lowered inflammatory markers over just 10 weeks, more effectively than a high-fiber diet alone in that particular trial. Diversity matters here because a thriving ecosystem, not just one bacterial species in isolation, is what ultimately supports Akermansia's environment. A small daily serving, a few spoonfuls of plain unsweetened yogurt, or a forkful of sauerkraut alongside a meal is enough to matter over time. More isn't necessarily better here, consistency is. Cranberries and green tea. Both are rich in polyphenols that researchers have found support Akermansia populations in a similar way to pomegranate, though with somewhat less research behind them so far. Unsweetened cranberry juice, or whole cranberries, and plain brewed green tea without added sugar are reasonable additions alongside the foods above. Neither needs to be a daily commitment. Even a few servings a week appears to contribute meaningfully when layered on top of the fiber and fermented foods already discussed. Caloric moderation and meal timing, a less intuitive finding worth mentioning. Several studies on intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating have observed increases in Akermansia populations, independent of any specific food. Why would simply eating on a schedule matter? The proposed explanation is that giving the gut extended stretches without constant digestion allows the mucus layer time to regenerate rather than being continuously broken down. This isn't a call to adopt an extreme regimen. Simply avoiding constant grazing throughout the day and allowing a natural overnight fast appears to be enough to matter for most people. What tends to work against it? Frequent antibiotic use, a diet heavy in ultra-processed food, and chronically low fiber intake are the 3 factors most consistently linked to Akermansia decline. None of that means antibiotics should be avoided when medically necessary. They absolutely shouldn't be. It does mean rebuilding your gut ecosystem deliberately afterward, through the foods above, is worth prioritizing rather than assuming it happens automatically. Quick question before we move to the close. Had anyone ever told you that your gut bacteria could influence how well cancer treatment works? Drop a comment and let me know. It's one of the most under-discussed connections in modern medicine, and I'd genuinely like to know how many people are hearing this for the first time. A few questions come up often enough that they're worth answering directly before we close. If I already have cancer, should I just start eating pomegranate every day? Food supports the environment your immune system operates in. It doesn't replace treatment, and it isn't a substitute for the conversation you need to have with your oncologist about your specific case. Think of it as strengthening the foundation the treatment is standing on, not as a treatment itself. How long does it take to change gut bacteria through diet? Research generally shows measurable shifts within a few weeks of consistent dietary change, though meaningful, stable improvement tends to take a few months of sustained habit rather than a single good week. Consistency matters far more than intensity here. Can I just take a probiotic instead of doing all this? Not yet, at least not for Akermansia specifically. A reliable commercial supplement containing this bacterium isn't broadly available for general consumer use. General probiotics support gut health in their own right, but they're not a substitute for the specific foods discussed today if Akermansia is the target. There's a quote from the novelist E.L. Doctorow that I come back to often when I talk about this kind of research. Writing a novel, he said, is like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. Science works the same way. We don't have the complete picture of the gut microbiome yet, and we probably won't for decades. But the headlights we do have are pointing somewhere real toward a bacteria that seems to matter for how well you age and for how well your body defends itself when it matters most. You don't need a prescription to start supporting it. You need a piece of fruit, a handful of fiber, and a little consistency. Think back to that Paris study for a moment, the one this whole video started with. 200 patients, identical treatment, and one bacteria quietly deciding who the treatment worked for. That's not a small detail buried in a research paper. That's a preview of where medicine is heading, where what's growing in your gut becomes as relevant to your outcomes as the prescription itself. If this gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe. This channel exists to translate research like this into something you can use. And if you found this useful, the next video breaks down exactly how inflammation quietly drives the aging process I mentioned earlier. Check it out. I'll see you in the next one.